Welcome to the Love Chronicles. I'm your host, Randy Love, and on today's show we have Dr. Katy Pinto. She's a sociology professor at the California State University at Dominguez Hills. We'll be talking about higher education, gender inequality, race, equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as caregiving. Make sure you tune in next week for part 2 because we'll only be covering part of our conversation this week. Welcome to the Love Chronicles. Thank you for coming on, Katy. It's been quite some time.
Yes, I am so excited to be here because it has been a long time since we've actually seen each other, even if it's virtually. So thank you for having me. Thank you for including my voice in your Love Chronicles.
Thank you. Thank you. You were one of the first people I thought of when I conceptualized the idea. I was like, she's the reason I got into sociology. Like, not even gonna lie. When I walked into the University 101 class, I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do with my life. I want to be a nurse. And then I realized like Dominguez Hills didn't have a nursing like path unless you were already a nurse. So I was like, I don't know
Yeah.
what to do anymore. And I just
Yeah.
remembered your teaching style. And I was like, I want to do what she's doing. I want to be a sociologist. And I'm still not doing that. So that's funny.
But you are, I think, in so many ways, right? Like that's the thing that I think people are like, what is sociology? Like all my life, everybody just thought that sociology was social work. Um, but it's not, right? I think
Right.
that there is this space of sociology where you bring just that critical lens to the work that you're doing, right? So wherever it is that you go, you're asking the questions that maybe other people are not asking. Like, why are we covering a story like this? Why are we not covering this story? Why, why does this community look different than the other one? Like you're asking, I imagine, questions that people are not asking. And I think that comes from a sociological perspective. And I am so honored that you would say that I helped you be a sociology major because that's how I became a sociology major. I saw someone teaching and I was like, wow, that's like just explaining my life. And after that, I was like, I want to do that. Whatever that job is, I want that job. It's like and I mean, I was really lucky that I think I saw it as a job and something that I could do. Um, and it for me it was really about trying to understand my life, that I didn't understand what was going on in my life. And that's, yeah, so for me that's exciting.
Yes.
That's all I want, just the one.
I definitely use a lot of aspects of the various things I learned in the program in my journalism and just like
Yeah.
everyday life. I'll think back to like triangulation. Don't do
Yeah.
like I learned that in a class. But enough about how I got into it. You said that you saw a professor that kind of you were like, "Ooh, I want to teach." Was it a sociology professor or just a teacher in general?
Well, you know what? I started at a community college. And, for your audience who has never taken a UNV 101 class, and to kind of mark like how the way back machine goes, you were a student at Dominguez Hills,
I
and
was.
I probably was new-ish to teaching. So
I
I
think I had
apologize
about
for
a year.
every mistake. But I taught a class that's called UMV 101 that's supposed to help you figure out like how to be a college student. And I think, and that's where we met.
Mhm.
And you were really one of the first students that I saw go through as a first year student, all the way like being undeclared to picking a major, going through your major, and then graduating. Like for me, that was, you got to have a lot of reasons to keep teaching because this is sometimes a thankless job. And for me, that was one of the things that always like keeps me coming back. And it's hard to have that sometimes, especially if you don't teach the classes that are with like first year students, like UMB 101. So for people who are listening, they should know that's how way back it goes. And so, I did not go to a 4-year college. I went to a community college first.
Mhm.
And I was also really pretty, in quotes, bad, right? What's the metrics of a good student or a bad student? I wasn't a great student in high school. I had like maybe a 2.0 GPA. I went to a lot of summer school. Let's just say that. And so, but I was at a good high school. I was in a magnet high school that did math and science. And, in a lot of ways, like it was tracking me into college.
Mhm.
So I knew about college and I thought, well, I can't go to a 4-year school because my grades aren't so great, but I can go to a community college. And
Right.
I went to El Camino College out here in the South Bay in Redondo Beach. And it was the first place where I started doing really well in school. I went from being a 2.0 student to a 4.0 student.
Mhm.
And I had a counselor who was like, what happened to you? Like, and honestly, what happened to me was that I started taking the classes that were interesting to me. I just learned about the things that I wanted to learn about that were in the GE that I was supposed to be taking, right? But I felt like I always picked a class that was like my first choice. If I had a list of, philosophy classes, I always picked the one that I thought was the most interesting philosophy class. So, but in sociology, I remember I took a social problems class.
Mm.
And for me, I grew up in, I'm an immigrant. I was not born in the United States, but I was raised here. And I also grew up at a time when I was undocumented for a good chunk of my life.
Mhm.
And I grew up also with a very religious family. And I was very confused about the world. I was like, how come some people are marked as criminals and like bad people?
Right.
Because there's a certain way of viewing the world when you're raised, in a church that was about viewing the world from a certain view. And I was like, yeah, but I don't get it. I was like, I was always just asking questions. I was like, I don't get it. And then I took a sociology class, and the sociology class was like, look, our society is like broken down in a
Mhm.
hierarchy, and we have different cultures, and like your attitudes are just, like a mix of that. And for me, I've always thought like just by some luck or experience of my life, my mom came here when she did. And by more luck and politics, I'm not undocumented anymore.
Right.
And so I really had experienced a lot of life feeling undocumented, illegal, a walking criminal, which is so hard. Like I realize now that I like some of that still follows me around, right? But at that point, it was most of my life. When you're a teenager, it just feels it really just shapes your whole life of what you think your future is. And so when I had the chance, when I became documented, it was really just because the political climate in the US had changed.
Right.
And I really only learned about that through sociology, right? I did not believe that somehow my family did anything correctly. Like, I could have thought that honestly, but had it not been for sociology, I'm like, yeah, no, it's just because we happen to be here at a certain time and the political climate shifted. And so for me, like to be able to understand my world in that way, I was like, oh, forget it. I was hooked. I was like, I just like all these little light bulbs went off in my head. And I was like, I like that. If I could do that for other people, that seems like a good job, seems like a good way to spend my time.
Mhm.
And that's really how I picked sociology, and I picked it so early.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways I think that was that was good. And I think for a while, I thought, oh, maybe I could have done this. Maybe I could have done that. And honestly, whenever I take like career tests, they're always like, professor, sociology. So I think by a lot of, trial and error, picked the right thing for me.
Right.
Mhm.
I think that's great because as a teenager, some people just know exactly what they want to do. And then they get to college or they start toward the career path that they think that they want to do, and it's not what they want at all. And they're like, okay, so what do I do now? And you were more in the
Yeah.
realm of, okay, where do I go? What do I do? Let's just see. And I think that's even more common, especially in
Mhm.
the United States. People have no idea what they really want to do, and they kind of fall into it through different circumstances, and that's what happened with you. That's what happened with me.
Mhm.
I honestly, I thought I wanted to be a nurse because my grandfather was diabetic and I would help him, and I was like, I want to help people and I want to do this, and then I realized me and science are not friends and this is not what I want to do.
Yeah. Mhm.
But like the different things that I learned from your university 101 class to the sociology of family dynamics and like all the different things that not only in your classes that I learned, but other classes in like I did criminology in sociology, I did um, transgender, but like
Mhm.
there were just so many different things in sociology, and you can learn so many different aspects of its society and
Mhm.
how everything works. And I think that's why I did it, and I feel like through your explanation that's why you did it, because it
Yeah.
showed you so many different aspects of life, and it led to where you are right now.
Yeah.
And speaking of, you not only did you did the traditional route where you did community college and then your bachelor's and your master's and your PhD.
Yeah.
We were talking before we started this, and you said that you were first generation. So
Mhm.
do you feel like you doing that and continuing your path has shined a light on people, other people in your family or those around you?
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing that
Mm.
I always struggle with hearing folks say that, like, oh, college isn't, important, and you don't have to go to college. And I tend to think, you know what, I don't have the privilege of saying that because I, my family is working class and we're immigrants. And the reality is, I'm not going to inherit any like intergenerational wealth, right? So there's lots of ways to create wealth, and there's lots of ways to create meaning in your life. And in my family, I think I also saw education as like a way to get some freedom as a
Mhm.
woman that I probably would not have had I not gone to school, right? Like
Right.
nobody would mess with me as long as I was in school. Nobody was bothering me about how come you're not married yet? How come you don't have kids? And I come from a lot of women who were single mothers. Like the women in my family, almost all of them got divorces and they came to the US. One of them, went to Mexico. So, and I was the first in the family to say, well, I'm going to go to college. And it happened to also be that at that time, right, I
Mm.
was able to go to college because I thought for a long time that I wasn't going to be able to go to college. And in high school, I was like, okay, I'm going to go to college. And so what that really has done, honestly, in like, I was kind of I am the youngest one in my family, in my immediate family. But in my extended family, I have 4 cousins that are like my brothers. And in Spanish, we say primos hermanos, which
Mm.
is like cousin brothers, literal translation. Um, because we grew up together. The moment I had gone to a good high school, I was like, oh, you know, their high school experience or their school experience is going to be better if we get them into a magnet school.
Yeah.
And all of my cousins went to a magnet school. And what that did for at least two of them is it put them on track for college. And I went to a community college. My cousins, one of them went straight to a UC, and the other one went to a small liberal arts college. Something I would have, they were good students too, but something that I would not have been able to do. And I understood that in a way that I could translate that to my aunt to make sure her boys were doing that. And it was something that I could translate to them, that I could say, hey, if you do really well in high school, unlike me, you could go straight, to a 4-year college. And, it's interesting because like when we talk about like student success, a lot of times we are talking about those students that go straight into a 4-year college, and we're not really thinking about some of the students that go to a community college. I didn't know that students that start at a community college sometimes have a harder time transferring into a 4-year college, and they spend much longer times in community colleges, and they drop out, they don't continue. And so I didn't know that. I knew that this was just one of the ways to get into college.
Right.
And I knew that because of my high school and some of the friends that I had in high school. I mean, I think it's had a really big impact on my family. My brother is older than I am. He had started college, but he was older. So we were not, we weren't documented then. So he really went to like a trade school. By the time he's 10 years older than I am. So by the time, I was documented, he was 10 years out of high school, right? Or not 10, but, and he went back to college later in life. And I think he always knew that that was something he wanted to do. And he's so funny because he calls me his big little sister. Like if I paved the way, right? And in some ways I did. I was like, this is what, here's what helped me, or like, here's some things that I did. And he had a different experience, because he started later, but he finished, and he actually, I think he double majored as well. But I think for us, it meant something, right? To have somebody go through, especially for the kids in the family. And I'm really grateful for that. But at the same time, it's really hard when you are in school and you realize like you're trying to just kind of figure things out. And I think now I think about that more, especially working at Dominguez Hills, when a lot of the students are first generation. And so I never really had, for being a sociology major, a lot of times when I looked at my own experiences in higher ed, I felt like, oh, maybe I'm a failure. Like, oh, this is hard because I'm not smart enough. Instead of being like, wait a minute, this place wasn't ready for me. They just like let people like me in. Like they don't even know how to deal with me. And now I spend most of my time doing that for students and like telling them, hey, this is hard. You have a lot of stuff. Yes, but let's think about the institution. Like, how come it's not offering night classes for you? How come it doesn't offer classes on a Saturday or Sunday? How come it doesn't realize you're like a whole person and you have a family and you have kids? How come we don't have better daycare? And they're like, yeah. So, I think that's, thankfully, right? Like, I think some of the sociology did that for me, but I feel like working at Dominguez Hills with first generation students, right, in the CSU, being able to take a step back and help them use the sociology to look at their experience as first gen students, first gen college students, right? Like just having them analyze that a little bit more critically, I feel like has changed the way that I move through higher ed, and I see the different groups and try to help students like understand where they fit in this larger, this larger, bigger project of education that I didn't really have when I was going through the program, or going through all the different programs that I did.
Right. There were a couple things that you touched on, but before we get there, I remember when I was in school, there were just so many. Well, that school is a relative word because I'm still in school. I did a very odd pathway. Like I graduated from a independent studies program in high school because I had my appendix out my senior year, so I missed the first semester.
Oh,
So I like crammed a whole year of school into 4 months, finished early, but then graduated
yes.
in June. And because of that, I guess I was prepared for school more so than I thought I was when the
Mm-hmm.
senior year started. But I did
Mm-hmm.
a 4 year and then took a break and did a 2 year program and then took another break. And now I'm back and I'm doing a master's program. So I don't know, my path
Yeah.
is wild. But you touched on gender and how like your family didn't really bother you because you were in school. So there's no time to be married and do the kid thing. Like, let me focus on school. That is a common thing too. It's like women are supposed to child rear early because if you wait too late, then you're not going to be able to do it. Like that's just like a mindset in society that doesn't quite make sense to me. I'm not sure if I'm
Wow.
missing something. Like I don't know what that is, but you touched on that, and I was just kind of curious, was that a conversation that did occur even though you were in school? Like, maybe it was less often said or not, but
They were talking behind your back. Maybe, well, the thing, I really am not exaggerating that. When I say to the women in my family, I think about my mom, and
Mhm,
I have two aunts
mhm,
in on my mom's side of the family, and they all did divorce their husbands, and they moved. Two of them came to the United States. One of them went to Mexico, and one of them got remarried. And she, had a family, settled down again. But my mom and my aunt, they didn't. They did not remarry. And they had this sense of they weren't wrong. I mean, my mom, I like to think about her as a woman in 19, imagine. That's what I tell myself. Imagine being a woman in a third world country in 1970. So I was born in Honduras,
mhm.
and in a third world country, in, maybe we shouldn't, well, who calls it? I've learned that term, a third world country, here in the US, by the
Yeah,
way. I don't think they refer to themselves as that.
no.
Um, anyways, and now I'm going to go down another track of like US Central American relations.
That's
But
that's the thing.
she was in a country where there's more patriarchy than I have experienced. Her mother was also really religious,
Mhm,
and she left her husband, and divorce, I don't know how prominent it was in the 70s in Central America, but definitely in the US, maybe it had a little bit more acceptance, right? Maybe women were starting to get a divorce. And so she came here, and I think was less judged than she would have been back home,
right,
and started a whole new life for herself. But at the same time, it was really difficult, right? And I think she always was like, I need her to be independent. You know, I need her to be independent and independent of a man. And that's, I share that too, because in my family class, we talk about how we socialize our children,
mhm,
and the intersections of that socialization based on race, on class, and on gender. And it just now makes complete sense to me that my working class single mom was going to raise me to be independent and be able to provide for myself
right,
independently of like what she saw as a, difficult institution for herself in marriage, right? And so I think that that was in direct opposition to my grandmother, right, who was more religious, had been married all her life, and her marriage was successful in her mind, right? Um, and I think that was really difficult, and my mom really guarded the me from that. Like, don't pressure her, don't
Yeah.
pressure her. There, I we talk about this too with in my class sometimes, in my family class in particular, because what are some of the things we don't talk about, Randy, right? So she, I say she because she's my mom is here, right? And the magic of the pandemic still means I'm at home. But the reality is that the things that my mom and her sister didn't talk about as women
Mhm.
were the basic biological facts of our bodies, and what that means. And I think there is a sense sometimes that women do get pressured to have kids, but no one's talking about like the biology.
Mhm.
Like, I don't really know what's going on in high school sex ed classes anymore, or
Nothing.
where, yeah, maybe nothing, right? But what is the science about our bodies? And the science behind our bodies is really that we should be asking our moms. This is the best advice that I give to women now, that they don't ask for it. But I'm like, don't worry about, people start asking you like, when are you going to have a baby? You need to ask your mom when she hit menopause. Like, when did you start seeing signs of perimenopause and menopause? Because that actually, if your mom happens to be your biological mother, right,
Mm.
if you're not adopted, or then their biological cues and those of your grandmother and their sisters are probably the best indicators of what your body might experience and whether or not you want to have children. And
Right.
so, in my family class too, we talk about how a family is not just biological, that
Mhm.
it can be, kids that are adopted. Like, it can take so many shapes and forms. And we know this, it's just not what we consume as like media consumers, what we see on TV. It's not what we talk about. Um, so there is that pressure in some ways, I think, for women, because our bodies are different, but then no one's talking about that biological part. And so it seems sometimes to just come from this place of like, oh, you should get married. And it just seems to be like, oh, because that's the way families are supposed to be, that's what women are supposed to be doing, instead of, you know well, look, here's what women's bodies do. you know and I feel like if we had more information, and then also, right, asking ourselves as women the question, like, do I want children?
Right.
Like, that's a question that nobody asks. And like, you know it's maybe people don't provide a space, because if you say, no, I don't want children, they're like, that's what you say now.
Mhm.
And maybe they say that from experience, that yes, they did not want kids, and then later they did, you know, sure. But those are not the ways in which, like, nobody's, sometimes people, strangers, just will try to have these statements that they throw at you, and that they haven't opened it up for a conversation,
Mhm.
you know. But now we live in a time and a place where technology is now assisting more women on their paths, right, to have kids.
Right.
And I think that's a real legitimate thing too, that there's a lot of research on egg donors. There's
Mhm.
also research on what it means, right? If you're a working woman and you're like, I'm going to freeze my eggs and maybe use them later, right? Those are all, I mean, those are some of the science conversations that we're not having. And all of this stuff is super expensive right now in the United States.
Very
In
much.
other countries, it's not. So, you know, I don't know. I almost feel like if I was younger, I would be like, you pay for me to freeze my eggs. Like if anybody asks me, when are you going to have kids? The moment you pay me to freeze my eggs is when I'll consider it. Because it's a super expensive. It leaves certain people in, it leaves certain people out.
Mhm.
And then we have this whole path of like parenthood, which
Mhm.
is adopting, that people don't talk about. And then we also have a whole nother group of people who are like, no, I do not want to have kids. And then, people judge them, and we shouldn't be. So,
Right.
because it brings up so many, it brings up so many things that I feel like we talk about with my students, and that I insert myself sometimes in conversations with young professionals. And I've been known to say it too on Twitter. I'm like, ask your mom when when she went through menopause. Like my mom did not talk about that. And
Yeah.
neither did her mom or her sisters. And I feel like it's a disservice to women everywhere. I don't think, I don't know that all the moms are doing that. I'm sure some moms are talking about it with their daughters.
Mhm.
But I feel like that's a conversation we need to have.
Definitely.
Huh.
I completely agree. And as you were talking about different things that you bring up to students in your family class, being one of your students from your family class, I'm like, yep, I remember that. Yes, I remember this conversation. And based upon the conversations we had in class, I brought up conversations with my sister, and because she's 6 years older than me, and with my
Yeah.
mom, and it just kind of furthered our
Uh,
connection to one another because my sister had her first child when she was 15 and a half. If
mhm.
she's listening to this, she's going to be like, stop talking about my life. But she was not the example, but she was like the first of the five children. She was the second oldest,
Yeah.
and she had a kid first. And it was just from there, everyone was like, oh yeah, kids exist for, young people. My niece
Yeah.
is now turning 21 in less than a month.
Oh,
So,
wow.
it's been
Yeah.
21 years since she had her child, but as a family, I was only 10, but everybody was there to support my sister with her child and help her through
Mhm.
school and help her raise my niece. And it's just like, that's not even a conversation that's being had. The support that you need to have a kid, especially, she wasn't doing it alone, but like, if you have to do it alone, people are pressured into having kids early so that they can do their career later. But it's like, you have to think about all the things that it takes to be able to raise a child, especially if you're a child or young or starting a career yourself. Like, that's not a discussion either. And
Mhm.
you said adopting. There are so many kids in foster care. There are so many
Mhm.
kids who are, in situations that they shouldn't be in because they're not looked at as viable. They're like the neglected, and that's not okay either. So yes,
Yeah.
you don't have to want a child. Some people don't, and there's nothing wrong with that. Fran Drescher
Yeah.
is an example. She never had kids. She did her
Mhm.
successful career. She's an advocate. She does all these different things, but kids weren't her focus. And
Yeah.
you have people that have plenty of kids.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then you have people who adopt. And there's so many different
Yeah.
pathways, and that is not
Well,
a
and
discussion.
I think a lot now about, what it means when we like what it means when we judge the things in our life
Mhm.
based on whatever it is that we think is like a normal in quotes bar, right? That we say, oh no, you should have your average age kid when, if you're 24, like that's an ideal age. And the truth is that we, if the pandemic hasn't taught us anything, is that we just don't even know anything about life, right? And so there are people who have now died when they're 30.
Mhm.
And when you think about someone's life in their totality, and you think, you know what, they were living their lives and then an illness like cut their life short. At least I tend to think, why are we spending so much time judging people for like things that they do early, on time, whatever, when we really should just kind of be thinking about, we should be grateful for the time that we have, and we
Mhm.
should be hoping that we're spending it in a way that when we pass, because we all will pass,
Mhm.
um, that we feel like we've told our loved ones that we love them, that we feel like we've contributed, that we have a purpose. You know, I don't know. I just, because I think about too, just how short some lives have been cut, right? And so, and we don't know. We just like, we just don't know about so many things that I don't like it now. I think that I think I have students question like, wait, what is that in comparison to? Right? What are we comparing ourselves to? If it's a two model family, what are you comparing yourself to? Why is that better? Why isn't it better? Is
Mhm.
it, are you making moral judgments, or are you making judgments just based on economics? Like if we had a better social support system for people, like wouldn't that change everybody's life too?
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like in this time, I've just been more reflective. And I spend a lot of time, actually, I think too, talking to students
Mhm.
who tell me, oh, professor, I feel so bad because, I'm in school now and I'm 20 something or I'm 30 something and I feel so bad. And I'm like, why do you feel bad? You're in school. Like you had a life, and life, whatever it is, kids, no kids, brought you here right now, and you're doing something for yourself. So I feel like our students, when they share these things with me, it's because they're sharing some measuring stick that we have in like larger society, and they're feeling like they're coming up short when they're doing something that in my view is remarkable, that I couldn't have done, that I didn't do, right? I didn't try to juggle kids and work and then get a BA degree, or even write my other degrees.
Right.
So to me, it hurts me so much when I see that there's some line that they're judging themselves to. And I'm like, you don't even know, you're already ahead of the game. And I work with students too that have been formally incarcerated
Mhm.
for 10, 20 years. And they're like, oh, I feel so bad about this other part of my life.
Mhm.
Mind you, our society keeps reminding them about that part of their
Right.
life instead of, actually like letting them move in our systems economically without having to check a box. We're doing that. Like
Mhm.
they've been, maybe they were incarcerated, they're out, they paid their time and they're dead, and they got an education while they were in prison. They come out, they come to college, and then they feel bad. I mean, being in prison, that is something to deal with, but they feel less than,
Yes.
right? And that is the thing that drives me crazy, because I'm like, no, you actually are a bright, shining example of perseverance, of resiliency, of, desire, will, and survival in a structure that's oppressive. And
Yes.
so, I think some of what you said just made me think about how we have this like yardstick somewhere, right? That the society says, which is often very white, very middle class,
Mhm.
that the rest of us are trying to judge ourselves against, and
Mm.
it's not helpful.
And you touched upon what I wanted us to close on. You had mentioned your brother deciding to go back to school and him being older than you. And I was thinking older students are a topic that aren't talked about either. You know, I'm young in comparison to, some most of society or whatever, but I'm just now going back for my graduate degree. And while like some people like yourself and others would be like, oh, that's great. So what? You're 30. Oh, whatever. You're going back to school. That's wonderful. I think the same way. Like, I am a career student and I'm proud of it because I like learning new things and it's just what I do. But I am working and doing other stuff. But
Mhm.
my thing the question I wanted to ask was older students. You had kind of brought them up off and on throughout, your brother and being one of them, but some of your students in class talking about having kids and then going to school. That is something that people don't really bring up often either. Taking care of your parents while being in school, taking care of your kids
Yeah.
while being in school, going back to change careers.
Mhm.
That is a topic that people feel bad about, that being something that they want to do because they're like, well, I'm 50. I shouldn't be going back to school. I should be
Mhm.
having my career or getting ready to retire because, when I turn 65, I just want to like stop doing. That's a societal programming in the
Yeah.
US at least.
Yeah.
That's so
Yeah.
common. How do you combat that when you have a student that brings something up like that?
Yeah, I mean, I like to remind people that a lot of the ways in which we think about like earning degrees in the US is different than what it is in the rest of the world.
Mhm.
That and that we are in a time and a place right now where higher ed is in a lot of ways, right? Like we're really focused on, and I don't know if that's also like it's in the US too, right? Like how can this help you get a job?
Right.
And then that job is the thing that you're striving for. And we don't we don't do a lot to help people see like a life course of a career of
Mhm.
our own lives, what that's like. And so um I know now, right at this age, I know a lot of my friends who went to school, got a degree, worked for a good chunk of time, and then they were like, oh, I don't like this anymore. They went and got another degree and
Mhm.
now are doing completely different things, right? um and so you see people shape like or shift, and you see how they're shaped by their own experiences.
Mhm.
And I think, a lot of what I tell students when they're returning to school is that school now doesn't look like it did when I was a student. And it definitely never looks like what it looks like on TV. And that if, that now we're just like catching up to what people are really doing. We're only now, some people are only now recognizing that students have basic needs or a difficulty meeting their basic needs, eating, shelter, right? Like we're just now realizing that, it was a problem before, but
Mhm.
now people are like, oh, look, we're not giving people as much financial aid. Oh, look, we're our students are hungry. Like that's something now that in higher ed, I think is happening more.
Mhm.
Like there's more attention to that. And so I tell students often it is true. The pressure is like, I want to get my schooling to get a, better job, better career. And I just remind them that while on TV, it looks like everybody graduates high school and then goes to college, that's just not the way that it is.
Right.
And that what you're bringing, I think at this point, so I'm also right now the director of our older adult center.
Mhm.
So when I talk about students that are older, I tell them, if you feel older, we can work together. 'Cause sometimes students that are 24 are like, I feel older. Like I'm not 18, and I'm like, you're so young. And they're like, no, I'm not, But then I also work with students that are like, hey, I'm 70 and I'm coming back to school. And I'm like, all right, well, we're here, and I say, look, life takes you in a lot of different places. You have experiences that a lot of people don't have. And why were we supposed to decide what we wanted to do with the rest of our lives when we were 19? And
Right.
why can't we change? Why can't we do something from when we're 19 to 25 or whatever, and then change our minds and do something else. Like, because, you just think about things as the longevity. I used to run a lot. And
Mhm.
so I always think about like a marathon, and I always think about my work like a marathon. And I say, how am I going to survive this marathon? And often it's like being flexible and adaptable and knowing that, it's slow and steady. Like that's how I'm going to finish. And in a lot of ways, our lives are like that,
Mhm.
that we don't really know. We know it's going to end. And we have a sense of like where we want it to be sometimes, right?
Right.
But we can't always just sprint to that finish line, because it's, we might burn out, I guess. But it's also can be meandering, and we're trying to figure things out. And so I think we need to give ourselves that space. And so I always tell students, like, no, like you're being too hard on yourself. I feel like I've seen so many different ways to get to the same place, you know, and that same place is maybe just being happy with what you're doing for yourself.
Definitely.
Yeah. And it looks different in I think in every country. I read somewhere once that they said in some European country, somebody, that was older, was getting another PhD. And that like an American asked that person, what are you going to do with that? And that they looked at him like, what do you mean, what am I going to do with it? I'm just learning, like, this is interesting. And so in a lot of ways, I do tend to think maybe it's the way in which we think about stuff, like that, oh, this is supposed to lead to a job, that sometimes we don't see the bigger picture.
Right.
That we're learning different things, that we're, pursuing our passions, that it's lifelong learning, and that our presence matters in higher education,
Mm.
right? Whatever your roundabout way of getting through school, if you feel like it's roundabout way, that matters in higher ed. The fact that they're not used to it, right, doesn't mean that you don't matter. And I think, sometimes people, they show their own biases, right? Like, oh, being surprised, like, oh, well, you're one of our older students. And you're like, hello, I'm younger than you are. But people show that because they think of a certain trajectory, and yes, maybe that is the trajectory of like an average student, but we're like, we can see that higher ed is changing, and as it should, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's
Oh no.
honestly what I tell students, because I'm like, you can't like talk yourself out of this now. So
Right.
like, you're
Like
here.
you're here.
Yes, all of those other things, are I feel sometimes there are ways, right? There are the insecurities that we have about, do I belong here?
Right.
And it is hard if you don't see yourself in certain spaces. Sometimes it's harder when you don't see yourself, you don't see somebody else your age, you don't see somebody else that's your gender, your race, or ethnicity. You're like, oh,
Right.
this is, and a lot of times maybe you are the first, and that's okay, right? So yeah, it is tough, and I think we have to be more sensitive to it as educators, and
Mhm.
sometimes we're not. So, that's hopefully a call for a lot of schools, right? You
Definitely.
don't hear any of this. So, I mean, I say this to also just think about, like, I don't hear students telling me, oh, I was an older student at this liberal arts college and they didn't know how to deal with me, right? You
Right.
hear it in certain spaces, like in more public education schools. And I think sometimes there are other institutions in higher ed that don't have that diversity of
Right.
age or experience. And so in public universities, you do. Um, And I think that's what's really great about them too.
Definitely. There's a lot to unpack there.
I know.
We might be able to do this again because I'm enjoying this conversation. So we should touch base again. Um, but yes, diversity within higher ed has drastically changed over, the past couple decades. And women, didn't think about going to school before because it wasn't a pathway that they saw leading to something, which is part of the problem with the mindset of some of the people in society right now,
Mhm.
going back to the 50s and, women being in the kitchen and doing all the stuff. No, women are allowed to think for themselves and get education and work a job and whatever they would like to do, they should be able to do that. And that you see that changing as time moves forward. So
Mhm.
um that is definitely a conversation that we need to continue
Yeah.
again in the
Well, and I think too, you're probably thinking a lot about it now as you make this transition,
yeah.
right? And I think you have to think about you're bringing in so much like lived experience in so many ways. I see that, the students that have other experiences, they've been able to hone in on what their passions are and what their interests are.
Hmm.
Or they've also identified, I haven't quite found it. So I'm still looking, right? And how do I carve that out for myself? And I think that's so important. Like you have to do that. And, kind of like not knowing and feeling like, oh, well, some people do this, like consecutively. Some people take a break, some people don't. And then not knowing like, well, what is this institution going to look like? And what am I going to look like in that institution? It just brings up a lot of the feelings and thoughts. And honestly, I mean, every time, Randy, I have been the first, even though I'm in higher ed, I feel like I shouldn't be the first, and I still am. Like, I'm the first Latina woman in the sociology department at CSUDH to get tenure.
What?
Yeah. Ever
Oh,
since that school started in 1960,
50,
50.
60,
There, I don't know.
one of
Now we don't even know.
those.
Yeah. And so I mean, that is a weird place to be. And
Yeah.
there's nobody else that you can look to for that and kind of guidance. So then it meant that I was the first Latina professor in the department to be a full professor. So as I moved up the ranks, I was still the first. I was the first professor and the female professor in the department to get an outstanding professor award in that department ever since it started.
And while that,
Like, it's crazy.
yeah, while it's crazy and it's like kind of unbelievable, it is also a hallmark to your talent and your dedication.
My stubbornness, my stubbornness. I think, but it's for me, I like to say it out loud because I think people sometimes they think, oh, well, higher ed must be so diverse, right? They must be so diverse because they let her in.
Right.
No, and I feel sometimes like as we move through like these positions of leadership at the institution, I'm always the first, and that's a really weird place to be in higher ed when you hope that it's diverse. And so, yeah, it makes sense, right? To be thinking about some of these things because you might be the first still, even in, 2021.
Yeah, I'm
Mm.
honestly, I at my student newspaper at Pierce College, I was the first Black female um editor in chief of the newspaper the year that I graduated. Like before me, there had not been a Black female editor in chief. So I completely understand. And I was one of the older students as well, because
Yeah.
most of them were, 5 or 6 years younger than me. because I
Mm-hmm.
went back to school for that. So
Yeah.
not only was I older slightly, I was the first to do something there. And that's gender is not the only diverse thing in higher education. There's the age diversity, there's
Yes.
the racial diversity, there's, the equity, like people coming in using loans or people using money that they already have. Like there's so much diversity within education that isn't talked about, and
Mm-hmm.
how all of those intersect and why people go back or go when they do. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I feel like it's 2021, right? And it makes it then the space when you are the first one, it's really difficult to feel your way around. And or it can be, doesn't have to be, but that's some of the jarring part of it,
mhm.
right? Because you realize, like, oh, and as you continue and you're in journalism, right?
Yeah,
That itself is a discipline, an institution that is not always known for being diverse, right? And
inherently white.
so, yeah, so then you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to be the first in a lot of these spaces as well. And so, and it's 2021. And so, in a lot of ways, it just shows us, I think, all of the work that we still need to do and how important it is to get more people, right? That like interested in things and moving forward. And I do love to say that I'm the first, but
You won't be the
I'm
last.
not going to be the only one. Now, we're going to have more people that are tenured in my department that are Latinx. We have one of my colleagues got an outstanding research award,
Wonderful.
and she's the first Latina in the department to get that specific award and the first female in the department to get that award. But it's like, no, it's like we're here, we're doing stuff. And I think that that's always hopeful, right? And I see too, like some of the people that I've worked with, the students that I've worked with are now earning their doctorates and they're moving on and they're, moving into their own careers. And that's what I think is great about education. You can carve your way and you can move into spaces where you were not there before. Yeah, you have to be in that moment, just like be like, damn.
Definitely. But thank you so
Yes.
much for stopping in the chat with me. It
Thank
has
you for
been
letting me
exciting.
talk your ear off.
With the most,
It has been such a long time.
yes.
Yeah, so I'm so happy you invited me, and I look forward to hearing more about the Love Chronicles.
I can't wait for you to hear more about
Thank
it.
you.
This is Randy Love, and you're listening to season 1 of The Love Chronicles. Laters, y'all.